There are moments in life that don't leave you. They settle somewhere deep in your chest and they stay there for years. I remember the smell of that courtroom on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Old wood, faint coffee from the back hallway, and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was tension. Maybe it was something closer to destiny walking through my door in a blazer that cost more than most people's rent. I remember looking up from my bench and seeing two people who could not have been more different standing in the same room. One had a watch that caught the fluorescent light every time he moved his wrist. The other had a small American flag pin on his collar, the kind you get at a veterans hall, not a boutique. And I remember thinking before a single word was spoken that one of these men had no idea who the other one really was. And neither did I, not yet. If that feeling of a story finding you at exactly the right moment is something you understand, then stay right here with me. Subscribe to this channel and hit that bell notification, because what I'm about to tell you is one of those cases I still carry with me years later. It reached past the paperwork, past the charge sheet, and into something I can only call the truth about who we really are to each other. This is a story about pride, about humiliation, about a debt that was owed and never known until it was. It was November 11th, 2023. I remember the date because it was Veterans Day, and there was a small wreath on the table near the entrance of the building that my clerk had placed there that morning. The docket was full, as it usually is on weekdays, and I expected what I normally expect: expired registrations, parking violations, maybe a moving citation or two. But I've been behind this bench long enough to feel when something is different. There's a shift in the room, a kind of electricity that has nothing to do with the weather outside. When my clerk called the first case and I watched both parties stand, I felt that shift. I put my pen down slowly and I paid attention. The defendant's name was Preston Aldridge III. He was 31 years old, and I noticed him before he even reached the front of the room. He walked like someone who had never once in his life been told to wait. His charcoal blazer was pressed with the kind of precision that says someone else pressed it for him. On his left wrist was a Patek Philippe watch. I know watches, I've always paid attention to them, and that one was worth somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm, the kind that suggests you've retained help even for matters that shouldn't require it. His shoes were Italian, dark oxblood, and they clicked on my courtroom floor with a rhythm that sounded almost like impatience. He had the kind of face that was handsome in a practiced way, the kind that had probably smiled its way out of consequences many times before. But I've seen charm walk through my door more times than I can count, and I know that charm and character are two very different things. The complainant, the man who had filed against him, was Harold Jasper, 69 years old. I found that in the file before I looked up, and when I did look up and find him, he was sitting quietly in the second row, hands folded neatly in his lap, waiting. He wore a clean plaid shirt and dark slacks, the kind of outfit a man chooses when he wants to show respect for a room. His hair was white, cut close, and his face carried the kind of lines that come from decades of real weather and real worry. Not the decorative kind, but the earned kind. I noticed his boots right away, work boots, polished carefully, but worn down at the toes from years of use. A man who takes the time to polish worn boots is a man who still has dignity and wants the world to know it. I respected Harold Jasper before he opened his mouth. The charge before me was a civil complaint, property damage combined with public harassment. The report documented the incident at 10:47 a.m. on October 28, 2023, in the parking lot of a grocery store on Whitmore Avenue. Harold's vehicle, a 1989 Ford F-150, dark green, had been parked legally in a standard space. Preston Aldridge had parked his 2024 Bentley Bentayga, jet black, in the adjacent space and was claiming that Harold's truck door had swung open and scratched the rear quarter panel of his SUV. The damage estimate submitted was $4,200. There was also, according to Harold's complaint, verbal conduct in that parking lot that Harold described as degrading and humiliating. I asked Preston to describe what happened in his own words. He leaned forward slightly with the kind of calm that belongs to someone who fully expects to be believed. He told me that Harold's door had struck his vehicle, that Harold had been dismissive and walked away, and that he had simply been trying to get fair compensation for real damage. And then he said, and I wrote this down because it mattered, "Your Honor, the man drives a rusted, beat-up old truck that probably shouldn't be on the road." I asked him to take responsibility, and he just laughed and walked away from me. I underlined the word rusted. Then I looked over at Harold, and I watched his jaw tighten for just 1 second before he looked back down at his hands. 1 second. That told me everything about the kind of man he was. I asked Harold to respond. He stood slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was measured and soft, the kind of quiet that comes not from weakness, but from a man who has learned exactly how much energy to spend and where. He told me the door had made contact, he acknowledged that, but that it had opened slowly, not swung hard, and that he had looked carefully at the Bentley and seen nothing. He said he had tried to show Preston this, but that Preston had gotten into his space and started raising his voice, telling him his truck was an eyesore, that people like Harold shouldn't be parking next to nice vehicles, and that he was going to make sure Harold paid one way or another. Harold looked at me and said, "Judge, I kept myself calm. I've served this country. I've handled situations a lot harder than a man in an expensive jacket." Something tightened in my chest when he said that. I asked him to tell me more about his service. Harold told me he served in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division from 1968 to 1971. When he came home, he joined the Providence Fire Department, where he worked for 31 years before retiring in 2014. Since retirement, he had been living on his pension and working 3 nights a week as a security guard to help cover the cost of his daughter Denise's asthma medication, a prescription that ran $340 a month out of pocket because of a gap in her current insurance plan. He told me the Ford F-150 was the only vehicle he owned, that it had been paid off for years, and that he maintained it himself in his driveway on weekends because he couldn't afford a mechanic. He said, "Judge, that truck has never let me down. It runs fine, and I'm proud of it." I looked at Preston when Harold said that. Preston was looking at the ceiling. "I want to stop here and ask you something directly. If you're listening to this right now and you feel that slow burn in your chest, that quiet building anger that comes from watching a decent man be looked down on by someone who has simply never had to be anything other than comfortable, then I dare you to keep listening. I promise you, what is coming next is something you will not predict. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now, because the people who stay until the end of a story like this are exactly the kind of people this channel was built for." I turned back to Preston and addressed the damage claim. I reviewed the estimate he had submitted. It was from a detailing boutique, not a certified collision repair facility, and it carried a timestamp of 11:30 a.m. on October 28th, the same day as the incident. That was less than an hour after the alleged contact. I noted that Officer David Ramos, badge number 4721, had responded to a noise disturbance complaint at that same parking lot at 10:52 a.m., 5 minutes after the alleged incident, and had documented in his report that he observed no visible damage to either vehicle at the time of his arrival. I read that finding aloud, slowly. I watched Preston's attorney shift his weight in his chair. I asked Preston directly how a damage estimate from the same day could exist if the responding officer saw nothing 5 minutes after the event. Preston told me the scratch was on the lower panel and may have been overlooked in the field. I told him I would need more than that explanation. I asked if there were photographs taken immediately at the scene before Officer Ramos arrived. Preston said he had taken photographs on his phone. I asked him to produce them. His attorney opened the leather portfolio and passed up a printed sheet, 2 images, both showing the lower body of the Bentley. I examined them carefully under the bench light. The images were low contrast, shot at an angle, and what appeared in them could generously be described as a surface scuff that might just as easily have been a pre-existing mark. I set the prints down and I asked my next question. I asked if anyone else had been present in that parking lot. Preston said he didn't know, and that's when Denise Jasper, Harold's daughter, who had been sitting 2 rows behind her father the entire time, raised her hand quietly. I had already received a note from my clerk before the session started that morning, telling me Denise had video she wanted to submit. I asked her to bring it forward. Preston's attorney immediately objected that it hadn't been formally submitted in advance. I told him this was my courtroom, that I would determine what was relevant, and that he was welcome to respond after I had reviewed it. Denise handed me her phone. The video was 47 seconds long and had been recorded by a woman named Patricia Sousa, who had been parked 3 spaces away and had filmed the exchange from inside her car. Patricia had found Denise through a neighborhood Facebook group 2 days after the incident, recognized Harold from the post that had been made, and I will get to that post in just a moment, and reached out to offer the footage. I watched the video twice, and I want to tell you exactly what I saw because it mattered enormously. Harold's truck door opened. It moved slowly, controlled, the kind of push a 69-year-old man with stiff shoulders gives a door in a parking lot. The door made the lightest contact with the lower side panel of the Bentley. Harold stepped out, looked at the spot, touched it with one finger, and shook his head in a way that said, "There's nothing there," and there wasn't. Then Preston appeared in the frame from the other side of his vehicle, and what followed was something I have thought about many times since that morning. Preston pointed at Harold's truck and laughed. Not a polite laugh, not even an exasperated one. He threw his head back and laughed the way someone laughs when they think they're performing for an audience. Patricia Sousa had typed out what she heard from her car. She sent the transcript with the video. According to her notes, Preston said, "Look at this junk heap. What is this, 1945? People like you should not even have licenses." Harold said nothing. He stood next to his truck and he absorbed it. And then Preston pulled out his phone and took a photograph of Harold standing there. He photographed him like he was a curiosity, like he was a display. I set the phone down on my bench and I took a long breath. I grip my gavel sometimes, not to use it, but to remind myself to stay measured. I gripped it then. I looked at Preston and asked him calmly whether he had taken a photograph of Harold in that parking lot. His attorney leaned close to him. Preston said, "I may have, yes." I asked why. He said documentation. I asked, "Documentation of what, sir?" He didn't answer, and in that pause I felt something travel through the room. Not quite anger, not quite sadness, but a kind of collective recognition that something wrong had happened and that everyone in the room knew it. Then Preston's own attorney, and I want you to understand this surprised even me, submitted a document he described as providing context. It was a printed screenshot of a post from Preston's verified social media account, published at 12:14 p.m. on October 28th. It contained one of the photographs taken in that parking lot. It showed Harold Jasper, 69 years old, Vietnam veteran, 31-year firefighter, standing beside his 1989 Ford F-150. The caption read, "When the parking lot looks like a junkyard, some people really should just take the bus." The post had accumulated over 11,000 likes. The comments beneath it were cruel in the specific casual way that cruelty becomes when it has an audience and no consequences. I will not repeat those comments. But I read every one of them that morning, and I want you to sit with what it means, what it really means, to take a photograph of a man without his permission and post it to 500,000 followers so that strangers can laugh at him. That is not documentation. That is a public dismantling of someone's dignity for entertainment. I looked up from the printout and I looked at Harold. He was looking at the floor. His daughter Denise had both of her hands pressed over her mouth, and I thought about what it must have felt like for him. This man who ran into burning buildings, who slept in jungle mud in 1969, who polished his worn boots that very morning to come to my court with respect, to find himself as a punchline on someone's phone screen, surrounded by strangers laughing. Before I could continue, Preston's attorney said something that I am going to address carefully. He said, "Your Honor, my client is a prominent public figure with significant business interests in this state, and frankly, this complaint is beneath the dignity of this proceeding." I held my gavel. I did not raise my voice. I said quietly and clearly, "Nothing that comes before this court is beneath its dignity, and no person who walks through that door is beneath mine." And then Preston himself, and I want you to understand, he said this looking directly at me, said, "Judge, with respect, this is a traffic court. You don't fully understand the complexities of public life at this level." I looked at him for a long moment. I have sat on this bench for a very long time. I have been called many things. But that sentence revealed something I needed to see. It told me that Preston Aldridge III believed, genuinely believed, that some people's lives deserved more careful handling, more protection, more dignity than others, and that he was one of those people and Harold was not. I want to ask you something right now, and I want you to answer it honestly in the comments. Have you ever stood somewhere, a parking lot, a store, a waiting room, and watched someone be made small by a person who had more money or more status? Have you ever been the one being made small? Leave your answer below. This community was built on exactly these stories, and your voice here matters as much as anyone's. I made a decision right there on that bench. I asked my clerk to reach Fire Marshal Anthony Bertolucci, chief of the Providence Fire Department's Records and Honors Division. He was available within 6 minutes and on speaker in my courtroom, heard by everyone present. I asked him about Harold Jasper, firefighter, retired, badge number 7734, Providence Fire Department. Chief Bertolucci said Harold Jasper was one of the most decorated members of the department in recent memory. He said Harold had received the Medal of Valor in 2009 for pulling 3 civilians out of a collapsed structure on Fenner Street after a gas explosion. He said Harold had never once failed a fitness review until his knees made it impossible to continue active duty. And then I asked him the question I had been building toward since my clerk had quietly handed me a secondary file note 20 minutes into the proceedings. A note that my team had pulled from department cross-reference records when Harold's name and the Aldridge family address had both appeared in a 2011 incident log. I asked Chief Bertolucci whether Harold Jasper had been on the crew that responded to a residential fire at 14 Pemberton Hill Road on March 3, 2011. There was a brief pause. Then the chief said yes. He confirmed it without hesitation. A kitchen fire that spread rapidly to the second floor of a private residence. The first crew to arrive found the structure already compromised and one occupant unaccounted for, a child, a 7-year-old girl who had become separated from her parents in the smoke and was trapped in an upstairs bedroom. The structure had been declared unstable before full evacuation was confirmed. Harold Jasper went back in. The chief said those exact words. He went back in. He located the child, shielded her, and carried her out through a hallway that partially gave way behind him as he moved. The girl was transported to Hasbro Children's Hospital for smoke inhalation and observation. She was released 2 days later. She recovered fully. The incident report listed her name as Emma Aldridge, age 7, residence 14 Pemberton Hill Road. The courtroom went completely still. I have experienced silence in this room many times. Silence after a verdict, silence after a confession, silence after someone breaks down on the stand. But the silence that followed Chief Bertolucci's words was different. It had weight. It had texture. I looked at Preston Aldridge III. The practiced composure was gone. His mouth was open slightly. His face had turned the color of old paper. His attorney was not moving. His leather portfolio sat unopened on the table in front of him, and I don't think he even noticed it. I let the silence sit for a full 10 seconds before I spoke. I counted them. I said, "Mr. Aldridge, the man whose truck you photographed and posted to 500,000 people as a joke, the man you told should not be allowed to park next to nice cars, the man whose boots and livelihood you decided were beneath your attention. That man went into an unstable burning structure on Pemberton Hill Road in March of 2011 and carried your daughter out alive." I did not raise my voice. I never needed to. Preston's eyes went to Harold. Harold was looking straight ahead. His hands were still folded in his lap, and I noticed they were trembling slightly, just slightly, but I don't think it was from anger. I think it was from something much bigger than anger. I then told the court what I had decided. First, the civil damage claim was ruled entirely in Harold's favor. The officer's field report, the video evidence, and the inconsistency in the damage estimate's timeline all rendered the claim unsupported. The $4,200 demand was dismissed in full, and Preston Aldridge would pay all court costs and filing fees. Second, I was formally referring the unauthorized use of Harold's image, posted to a monetized commercial social media account with advertising revenue attached, to the Rhode Island Attorney General's office for review under privacy violation and harassment statutes. I made clear that this referral was not punitive theater. It was a recognition that when someone uses another person's image without consent for public ridicule and profit, that crosses a line that a simple apology cannot erase. Third, I was ordering Preston Aldridge III to complete 250 hours of community service with the Providence Fire Department's Community Education and Auxiliary Support Program, not a financial contribution, not a charity check written from a distance. Hours, in person, starting within 30 days. I told him I expected him to arrive in clothes he was willing to get dirty, because the men and women he would be serving alongside had never owned anything they weren't willing to get dirty. I then did something I don't always do, but felt I had to do that morning. I asked Harold to stand. He rose slowly with that same unhurried dignity he had carried all day. I said, "Mr. Jasper, this court acknowledges your military service to this country from 1968 to 1971. This court acknowledges your 31 years of service to the people of this city. This court acknowledges your personal courage on March 3, 2011. You came into this room today seeking a fair hearing, and I hope you leave knowing you received one. Your truck is not an eyesore. It is not an embarrassment. It is the property of a man who has earned, more than most, the right to park it anywhere he chooses." Harold looked at me and he nodded once. His eyes were wet. Denise, behind him, had tears running down both cheeks, and she wasn't trying to stop them. And I felt, not triumph, not satisfaction exactly, but something quieter and more durable than both of those things. Something that I can only describe as rightness. Preston sat very still for a long time after I finished speaking. At some point, without being asked, he turned slowly in his chair and looked at Harold. I watched him try to find words. Harold turned and looked back at him, and what passed between those two men in that moment was not mine to narrate. It belonged entirely to them. But I will tell you what I saw on Preston's face. I did not see the person who had walked into my courtroom that morning. The confidence was gone, the performance was gone, and what was left underneath looked young and uncertain and genuinely shaken. The face of someone who had just been handed information that rearranged something inside of him. Whether he would do anything with it, I couldn't know. That part was up to him, but Harold gave him one slow, even nod. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement, the kind that says, "I see you seeing me now. In my experience, that is where most real things in a person's life begin." I've thought about that morning many times since then. I've thought about all the Harold Jaspers who never get a courtroom, who just drive home in their old trucks after being laughed at in parking lots, who never find out what the other person learns too late to say out loud. I've thought about what it costs a person to be made small in public and how that cost is real even when no dollar figure is attached. I've thought about what it does to a society when we stop looking at the flag pins and the worn boots and the quiet dignity and start only seeing what a person drives. Justice in my courtroom has never been just about fines and charges. It has always been about the basic human insistence that every person who stands before me deserves to be seen fully, their whole story, their whole life. Dignity is not something you earn by buying the right things. It is something every human being carries from the moment they are born. My job, the job I have given my life to, is to protect that, especially for the people who walk in quietly, who fold their hands, who polish their worn boots, who say, "I kept my calm," when most of us would not have. Those are the people this courtroom was built to protect. Those are the people I think about when I drive home at night. Thank you for being here for this story from beginning to end. That matters to me more than I know how to express simply. If this moved you the way it moved me, please share it with someone today, someone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people carry extraordinary stories, and that sometimes justice really does find its way to the right room at the right time. Subscribe if you haven't, because next time I'm going to tell you about a young mother who drove 400 miles without a valid license to get her son to a specialist, and what happened when she walked into my courtroom thinking she had absolutely nothing left to lose. That one is going to reach you somewhere very different, and I think you'll want to be there for it.